Folks. Hiya, man. All right, let's get you on the screen, and we'll try to adjust your audio levels. Sorry.
Okay, yeah,
Uh,
no
I
worries.
don't know if you're watching the stream right now, but we were talking a little bit about a fashion week that's currently going on right now in Mumbai. I don't know if you heard of Lakme Fashion Week.
No, I haven't heard of it.
Yeah. Uh, okay. Here doesn't seem to want a full screen, so I'll just drag your picture manually over there. There we go. Hi, hope I'm catching you, in good lighting and in good health. How are we doing over there? You're okay with that? I kind of framed you in like how I introduced you as like a travel vlogger. Do you think that's kind of like a fair way of describing your content on YouTube?
Um, yeah, I mean, I do a bit of a mix of videos. The past couple of videos on my channel were mostly focused on, yeah, traveling around China and trying to visit like emerging fashion cities. Um, I think a lot of focus within designer fashion is mainly on Japan, Tokyo shopping vlogs, and then obviously there's some in Korea. But I was quite curious about China because it's a huge country, and so within Asia they definitely are kind of pushing the boundaries of fashion. So that's kind of what I wanted to capture with the last couple of videos. But prior to that, I am based in the US, and so I was doing, I would say, more like pickup content and just kind of discussing different brands that I was into.
Nice, nice. And like I think like at the beginning, your first videos are very uh keyed into like I think avant-garde designers, keyed into people who are like a bit north or out of the way from like I think your traditional channels of like talking about menswear from like the angle of streetwear or of classic
Mhm.
hashtag menswear or stuff like that. There's definitely I think on social media and on the internet in general a large population who are into like say Rick or Greg Lauren or Kiko Kostadinov or designers like that, Carol Christian Pole, Queedy, the list goes on, right? It is, I think, its own specific niche. Would you say like you sort of started in that niche, or like did you kind of come to that from somewhere else, like before even
It,
necessarily you had a YouTube channel?
yeah, interesting. I mean, what would you define as like the avant-garde brands? Like more on the dark side, such as you said, CCP and like Boris Pigeon Sperry, or would you be just talking about more niche brands like Kiko Kostadinov?
I think Kiko, like it being like such like a proponent of like futuristic cuts and like sort of that sort of
Sure.
not necessarily technological cuts, but like stuff that has like a degree of like almost 20th century ideals of futurism baked into like the core brand identity is kind of lumped in with the avant-garde people. But
Sure.
like avant-garde, I would just sort of uh, like not necessarily define in terms of like a practice or the degree of artisanalship, but like sometimes those are parts of the core brand identity of some avant-garde houses, but instead this sort of view of like luxury not necessarily coming out of the a particular heritage of the house or the fineness of the material, even as much as the willingness to try to be experimental, to be like an
Mhm.
alternative of traditional beauty standards or ideals, if that makes sense. And folks who are like in that sort of wheelhouse go all the way from like I don't know, uh, CDG, Comme des Garçons to like I don't know who else you would describe as that, but like it feels like a very nebulous thing. I do agree with you that it feels kind of nebulous, but it
Yeah,
is
no, I mean,
usually I think very appealing to people who aren't interested in fashion as like a stuff that sort of signifies luxury versus signifies a sort of interesting like approach to design, right?
yeah, no, I mean, I think you make a great point with just alternatives to maybe traditional luxury or traditional clothing options. Obviously, that encapsulates a lot, but I guess that's how I kind of get interested in brands is maybe they're taking something and providing a slightly different angle on it. Um, some of my favorite brands would include Head Manor. This is like, if you're watching it, maybe don't go all the way back to my first video, but I talk about, some of my wish list items. And at the time, I was really into Head Manor and kind of how I view a lot of his clothing is like really classic looking patterns, fabrics, colors, like Nothing feels futuristic. However, the cuts of it is like this absurdly oversized silhouette, or just like really dramatically oversized, where it's taking something that's like really rooted in a classic feeling. Even if you don't know exactly where you've seen this fabric or color, it just feels classic. And then the disruption of that is the extreme oversize, which is a more modern take, a more modern style. And so there's so many different ways that you can sort of disrupt a style or make it avant-garde in a sense. But I think the brands that I gravitate towards generally are rooted in something recognizable, but just feel like a slightly experimental take on that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that I, sympathize with. If that's the correct word, sympathize with, emphasize. But I was just discussing earlier in the stream that like one of the first shows that like really got me interested in like fashion as a hobby was some of the stuff that Tom Brown was doing, right? And his
Sure.
obviously influenced by like CDG and like is trying to like create these very uh, I don't know if argumentative, but like very, very like unwearable, some would say, silhouettes in terms of like changing the silhouette of like a human body to like emphasize grotesqueries or being super oversized or super shrunken or something like that. Did that sort of was like my beginning into like viewing luxury fashion to be like a legitimate creative expression and something to kind of keep up with. What was like I was asking about what do you think like were your first sort of shows that like really influenced you to think about like, oh, this is something that has like a whole depth to it that like is kind of drawing me to it as a hobby.
Oh, that's interesting. um, it's a little bit hard to pinpoint for me, like the first brand that felt, you know, I, that I was like, okay, I'm into fashion now. Um, I remember early on when I was maybe 7 or 8 years ago. Uh, I was looking at Adder Air, which is a South Korean brand. Honestly, I'm not that into their stuff anymore, but essentially, I think a core idea of the brand is they have these mistakes, like different misstitches and tears on the clothing, weird cuts, and so the whole brand revolves around different errors of clothing production. And it was weird and interesting, and so I thought that this was, I would just get really excited to seeing new releases from them. And I think when see the beginning of that rabbit hole, you can really start to find so many brands that are, um, you know, disrupting the status quo and doing their own thing. So yeah, then the world kind of opens up to you. Start to find more and more designer brands that are interesting. And then you can get into a little bit of what's the concept behind this brand. But I think for me it really didn't start as a depth sort of thing. It was just like, this is some radical clothing that you're not seeing on the street, or um, you're not seeing with your friends. So I don't believe I was inspired by like my actual surroundings, more so just what I was seeing online, and like how imaginative clothing could be.
Yeah, yeah. That depth of imagination, that like sort of spark of like not just oh, this is like a garment to show so I could flex onto people like a Gucci belt, but something where, it can be a sort of being in conversation with a way of thinking about the world. That's like I think a core part of why designer fashion is so exciting to me personally, right? Um
Sure.
it so from there, like you said that like you started engaging with the brand online and the sort of fashion that you kind of grew up with and you had around you, like was it like did you have like a degree of interest in like pursuing like a luxury item, or was it only just like a sort of at a remove, okay, I follow this in the same way that like, I might follow like a sports team that I like, right? Like was it
Sure.
followed like that, or did you actually start buying at that point? Because like your first content is like you said revolved around a lot of about talking about specific brands and pickups from those brands. So like was
Yeah.
consuming specific items always a part of it, or was it always like because again, from my personal, I guess, background, is that like I first start noticing that obviously with I described Tom Brown, but also a lot of what the early Margiela stuff was, because one of the first things that you find when you look up like all sorts of alternative fashion is Margiela, and the idea of like making a coat out of like a car wash, brush or whatever the heck that they were doing back then. But like it was always something that felt out of reach. That felt like this is when something that you can actually buy. You don't buy these runaway designs. You don't buy like these garments that are like handmade to have like these little human imperfections as you were describing with Alder Era, right? So like, was it an impulse to like actually try to acquire some of this stuff? And if so, like, what were you acquiring?
Yeah, if I'm honest, it was definitely about buying the stuff. I think you'll see some YouTubers who are like, you don't need it. You can delve into more of the runway analysis, or it could be meaningful from purely looking at it. But for me, it was definitely always about wanting it, and then I would also, like you said, follow it like a football team, maybe, where I'm really tapped into, what's coming out, what the brand is doing. Obviously, a runway show is going to be, 9 months to a year before the collection actually comes out. So I'm following it in that sense. But, you know, part of the exciting thing about a runway show to me is, okay, these pieces are going to be for sale. So, um, yeah, I think the clothing is most applicable, most interesting to me when I want to wear it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when you started buying your first things, were you buying accessories first? Were you buying the ready to wear? Like, because Alder Air, what you're describing, like that seems to be like almost inside baseball levels of like, okay, we're talking about this stitch versus that stitch. Like, so were you buying like hoodies and stuff, or were you buying like I don't know accessories?
Yeah, I was buying hoodies. I rarely buy accessories. I'm definitely like more of a clothing person over accessories and shoes. That's definitely where I like lean towards passion wise. So in college, when I, started to have a little bit of money for myself, I would, yeah, buy hoodies and usually casual items. I mean, I don't have that many occasions where I will need to dress super formal, and so yeah, I'm typically looking at brands that verge on kind of a casual, more casual style. Um, but yeah, for me, it's always something that has a little bit of a subtle twist. I think even though like I've gone through various phases with brands that I don't care about anymore, like Adder Air, for example, is like not
Mhm.
really on my radar so much. But still, when I think about the different stuff I was buying back then, it was like a hoodie where maybe it had this like kind of fake repair on the side that unless you really had seen this, you were following this brand, you wouldn't know where it was from. And so I really kind of am interested in that if you know, type stuff.
Hell yeah. Okay, so how does I guess how long did it take for like your love of like engaging with these brands lead to working and making content for YouTube?
Probably thought I probably was interested in buying, fashion from a little bit more designer brands 5 years prior to starting a YouTube channel. Um, yeah, yeah, 5 years.
So like so why YouTube then, like because there's one thing from just like in terms of enjoying this stuff and sort of I guess like enjoying expressing yourself on a like a sort of level of personal style, and
Yeah,
then there's another level of like, oh, I'll post a pit fic, and then like no, we'll jump into the community, we'll start participating in the conversation. What made you want to be a YouTuber?
sure. Yeah. Well, I went to college in Minnesota and I was living there after college as well. And so not that many people care about designer fashion. If you live in the US, you probably are familiar with this. Um, Depending on where you are, you can have a small community, but obvious in general, designer fashion is like kind of an international community. And so I think usually people at some point resort to finding community online or, in a Reddit forum, in a Discord, on YouTube. And so, yeah, I think part of the motivation was to, have a community or think, people to talk to about some of the clothes I was interested in. I also really remember at few years ago, I was pretty interested in Our Legacy. I still like the brand, but I remember Daniel Simmons, which is a British YouTuber. He would always show these Our Legacy pieces, which were like the exact Our Legacy pieces that I didn't like. Like, essentially, I was liking everything that was not being showed. And so I thought, even if you like some similar brands that are kind of really out there and, not totally undiscovered, there's still a lot of nuance in fashion that you can kind of add something to the conversation. And so initially, I just kind of thought, people weren't touching on some really good pieces. My first video was like a wish list video, so I just kind of wanted to talk about like this is some cool shit. That was kind of the idea. Um, but yeah, I didn't have like massive aspirations. It was just kind of to talk a little bit more about fashion that wasn't being talked about.
No, it totally makes sense. Like, there is such a degree of like, stewing in your own taste and seeing like, well, why aren't people talking about this? Why are people talking about that? And like, because again, it is like, I think a community that like is the strength of like designer fashion. It's not just like a total downstream consumption. It is this idea of like people who are invested in like the history of a designer or of a brand and being able to talk about this season versus this season and the evolution of a particular garment and stuff, something like that as it becomes iterated. So yeah, I think that aspect of community driving one to like sort of create is like super exciting because that's why I'm here on the Twitch platform. Is an attempt to like sort of grow a community here on this sort of streaming situation versus just say on Instagram or on YouTube. Outside of that, let's move on to like how you kind of graduated from that to like taking the camera outside of the house, right? Because it's one thing to kind of put up like a camera in your room, you can control the lighting, you can do as many takes as you want, what have you.
Yeah.
But like you started doing content about first of all running. I think you first had like a bit of content about going out
Yeah,
and really field testing. Like, was it Satisfy Running was the brand that you made some videos about?
exactly.
So talk about that. Like, what got you to get the camera out of the house?
No, that's a good question. I mean, with I think one of the niches in fashion that is really cool to me is this kind of blend between athletic gear and from fashion and more like experimental designer fashion. Um, I'm from Colorado, and a lot of fashion is kind of outdoor oriented, like your North Face, Solomon type gear, which is super practical. And I think oftentimes practicality is a trade off with style. Uh, so you're losing some style for, a more feature heavy piece, which I don't think I don't need like hyper practical clothing. So tech wear is definitely not my like scene or style. But then I was getting into running, and if you haven't seen or looked at Satisfy Running yet, I really recommend it. It's basically a technical running brand, so all their fabrics are like performance oriented, but they're doing stuff that is purely for an aesthetic purpose. Like they have these shirts that are called the moth textile, and they basically like body map holes throughout. So it's like a hyper distressed shirt that is supposed to be more breathable. Who knows if that's like the holes in it really make that much of a difference, but it's essentially like, moving in this heavily distressed trend that's like aesthetically cool if you like that, and then kind of marketed and with running type graphics. And so when I think brands can authentically take on like a sport or do something and it doesn't feel cringy, it feels like it's a fine line essentially, but they make clothes that are really good to run in and, in my opinion, enhance the activity while still kind of like dressing it in a way where you're not sacrificing all of the style for some like, um, you know, 80s neon type athletic gear. So anyway, I think, that was really interesting to me outside of just the normal designer brands I was following that, come out with runway shows and stuff. So I there was a German YouTuber. His name is David Moser. He posted like a lot more avant-garde stuff, more like in the CCP, Elena Dawson realm. and he was posting some satisfied running stuff as well. So it's still a relatively small brand, but I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Um, and then, yeah, I guess as you make a couple more videos, you just kind of see what interests you. At the end of the day, no one can afford to buy a piece of clothing like, every single week. And so I just wanted to talk about different aspects of, what interests me with fashion.
Sure, sure. I guess like then the next step is going, okay, well, I've watched enough in terms of like other creators on YouTube. I know generally how like they put together like the editing of like a video, even reviewing like say a pair of sneakers or something like that. That means now I got to bring a tripod, I got to bring a camera. I've got to have some degree of equipment now. I got to bring that out onto the field to like show like me like moving in the product. I've got to set the camera down, turn on record, and then run away from the camera, perform an action, then come back and turn off the camera, right? Like that's a huge
Sure.
jump, I think, from just talking directly to camera. So like talk about like that first experience and like how you felt doing so.
Yeah, I appreciate all of you know, the background you gave, because that essentially is the process. Some of the steps that, filming like a 15-minute segment that's, okay, we're gonna cut to this little, music part, and it's just like a really short part where you're doing something in the piece of clothing you're showing. Obviously, that requires a lot more time because you're essentially staging out what you want to do. So you do everything twice because you'll go and then you'll come back to the camera, you'll find the location. So I appreciate that you know all of that, the steps behind that. Um, but to me, that's probably the most fun part because I'm not that interested in showing off. Like, obviously, there is an angle to showing expensive clothing online that could be just viewed as, purely a flex. But that was not the point ever. It was much more to talk about the clothing, not my own acquisition of the clothing. And so if I can make it a little more interesting or do the clothing more justice by, having it in a cool place or making it look cooler, having just a video that to me is, how I would want to wear the clothing is how I think improved a couple of my videos. Because yeah, if you look at maybe someone makes a pickup video and it gets a couple thousand views, and you're like, I could do the same thing. But then their video is them, they tried the clothing on in their room, blah, blah, blah. And then you do the same thing. It's not that interesting because you're just making the same video. But if you can, for me, when I started feeling a little bit more happy with some videos was when I was, putting it in a little bit of a different setting.
Yeah, putting it in like a context, right? Like the context either you experience it in or like the context in which you first discovered it, which leads me to like I think your travel content, right?
Yeah.
So like what led you to start wanting to do travel content and like I guess I don't know if like I would describe it as travel pickup content because there is like I think a bit of focus on the manner in which you discovered the pieces, right?
Yeah. Actually, I traveled a lot this year. I went to Italy and I plan to film some videos at Slam Jam, Milan-based boutique, or
Mhm.
primarily online, but they have a store in Milan. And then also Antonio Lee, really good stores. I would check them out online if you can. But I wanted to highlight those stores, and then I was going to go through Munich and Vienna, a couple other big cities in Europe, and try and like film basically a video in each city. But this is quite challenging if you have I was just had one backpack, and, so I actually sent all my stuff back, like my computer and my camera and such, um, when after Milan, like, I was just like, "This is too much," because I was also staying in hostels, and so if you try and put yourself in this, um accommodation setting, you don't have like a plug right next to you. So it's a little bit of a nightmare, like charging batteries and your camera and computer and stuff. And I have a really small channel, so it just wasn't a worthwhile trade off between like, putting this much emphasis on making, a shopping blog and then actually experiencing the city. So uh, I kind of actually was like, this isn't worth it. I really, would say respect to the people who create travel content regularly because it takes a lot of, it takes a lot of time out of your day that when you want to see a lot of things. But then I went to Japan and South Korea in the same trip, and the fashion was really amazing, really, really cool. So I kind of did like a pickup segment after that with just showing the clothes, but not actually in Japan. Um, and after I posted this video, my whole YouTube feed was like Japan shopping vlog, Japan pickups. Like it's crazy how many people have done this. Every fashion YouTuber probably has gone to Japan in the last 2 years. I still recommend it. Like not to say that it's not worthwhile, but it's definitely like saturated as far as like from a content perspective.
Mhm.
But if you search like shopping in China, nothing, bro. There's so little. I mean, maybe some women's content, but as far as like the menswear scene, for a country this big and a economy that's developed so rapidly, there's very little coverage. And also, China has cut off internet access, so they don't use Google. So I just felt like the firewall in their fashion, there was like not the same exposure compared to what you're seeing in Japan, where it's really out there. So I thought that would be really interesting from a video perspective, really interesting to show because it is for one, I think it could be a really interesting trip selfishly. But then from the fashion point of view, I thought, wow, Korea, Japan, they're so far ahead. They have so many amazing stores in these, in just one city. You can find like 20 great stores. So I was really curious if I could find the same thing in China, and that's really what motivated more of a focus on, okay, I want to make a video in each of these kind of emerging fashion cities. I packed a bigger bag that had like a structure so I could comfortably carry a laptop, and I made it so I made it was a priority to basically put out a video each week or so.
Okay. So in terms of like China, like outside of like obviously all the effects that you listed about China, was there like a particular like personal connection you had to like the country, or do you have like a local fixer who was like telling you in advance like, oh hey, these are the hot spots? Why isn't nobody talking about this, that, and the other? Like, what exactly drew you to like an entire series about China specifically?
Yeah. I was a diver in college, springboard diver, and we
Uh,
took a training trip to Beijing. So I'd been there once before, and you you know, China does not have a great reputation for the Western world, like America, Europe. Most people, like, for example, when I was in Europe, I would ask different Europeans at hostels, like, people would say, "Oh, where are you traveling to? Where do you want to go?" And all these Europeans, man, they had like a laundry list of places they wanted to visit, like every country you can imagine,
huh.
somewhere in Africa, everywhere, but not China. And so I would ask occasionally, like, "Oh, how about China?" No one wanted to go. I think this is kind of like a blind spot for some people because it's a big country. It's similar size as the U.S., so there's essentially a lot to see. Um, I thought from that perspective, it could be interesting because maybe it's not as touristy as a place like Japan where people know, there's good stuff to see. And so I
Yeah.
thought, maybe in a world where everything is so out there on social media, this will be a country to visit that is not touristy.
Uh,
Actually, I was totally wrong. China has 1.3 billion people, so it doesn't matter if there's no foreign tourists, international tourists, because their domestic population makes it so it is, there's so many people traveling, so many Chinese tourists everywhere. So that shouldn't be the reason you go, but I still think you can have a really interesting experience there.
Sure, sure. So let's talk about like the process of like I guess planning that trip, right?
Yeah.
You have like obviously a process where like you have to like apply for the very basics of visa, right? without a visa,
Yeah.
I think on our American passports, they don't like our passports so much. We can only visit the country, I think, for 10 days without a visa, and that's only with a ticket out to another country. It's sort of like
It,
transit visa experience, right? So I assume,
mhm,
like, for your series, because you're visiting so many cities, you went out and got a real visa. Tell us about,
yeah.
like, I guess that experience.
No, you're absolutely right. When I over the summer, I believe you could only stay in China for 24 hours as an American. But now they're kind of opening it up more, so you might be right. It's either 6 or 10 days that you can stay visa free, as an American. Some Europeans, I think now you get 30 days. But, um, but I wanted to stay longer, and it's huge country, so I thought I need more time. I have time right now. So to get a visa, you need to go to a Chinese embassy that is closest to you. From Colorado, the closest one is in Chicago. So as you can imagine, it's super inconvenient. Then they take your passport and when you file an application, and so you have to stay there for 3 to 4 days and then pick up the application at the end. So minimum you're basically paying to go to one of these cities unless you live there and then stay there for almost a week. So it's kind of an expensive process to get it. But then once you get the tourist visa, I applied just for a year multi entry and they gave me 10-year multi entry visa. So I think, upfront, there's a long process, but then once you get it, you're good for a while.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I think it's pretty unlikely to get declined because essentially you're a tourist, you're spending money. So why would they decline you?
Yeah.
Um, but it's more just from a government perspective that, both countries, similarly, I was told by Chinese people, it was quite difficult to get a visa to travel to the US, vice versa. So anyway, yeah, upfront it's a hassle, but then now for me, it's no longer a concern.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think, one of the biggest things that like stops a lot of Chinese content from appearing on YouTube, from like regardless if it's a fashion community, just like travel in general, if they're not already like located and are like non-visitor to China proper, right? Like they're there for business, they have a job there, they actually based out of the country. That's most of the YouTubers that I see, anyway. But like talking about barriers of entry, like how hard was it to like research the kind of places that you wanted to go to? Because unlike I think like say Japan, there isn't like this degree of like, oh, we ship internationally, we make our marketing and our sort of product for an international audience from like a retail perspective and from like say a designer's perspective. Like a lot of this stuff for China seems to be, like you said, because they have a population of like 1.3 billion people. It's good
Yeah,
for like just their own home
yeah.
market. So like, how do you kind of cross that barrier of entry and like do your research?
No, you're exactly right. It's a good question. I mean, if you are watching or you have any questions about traveling to China, you can pri- send me a private message. My YouTube is just Duncan Lester, and my Instagram is also just Duncan
Yeah, we'll
Lester.
be spamming that in the chat, of course.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because there is some nuance to it, but it is more difficult to research because, for example, if you want to search a store in Japan, you can go to a brand you like say you say Comme des Garçons, or you say um, Camille Fortkins, whatever, and you search their stockists, and then it'll show you every store in Tokyo. So this is
Uh-huh.
how I went to most stores because maybe I choose a Japanese brand, like I really like Fumito Ganryu, then that would essentially lead me to a lot of stores that carried other Japanese brands that maybe I wasn't as familiar with. So it's really easy just on Google. If you're searching stores or you're searching what to do, everything's on Google. But in China, they use it's called Baidu is their main search engine. They don't have Google. You would need to go through a VPN. So even though the VPN process is not that difficult, it makes it so there just isn't as much information as Google because the local people, Chinese, are not posting on Google, right? If they're posting an article about a place they really recommend, it's on Baidu in characters. So it's essentially useless to me researching beforehand. So I would say you can find the main tourist attractions on Google, but you're not going to find the niche stuff, and you're not going to find the stores. So there's a couple. There's a couple different ways. I mean, you just kind of find your own process like through trial and error. I would say my like primary recommendation is to um there's this phrase, it's called "mai shou dian." It means buyer store. And you if you copy these characters and put it into the Chinese maps, it will pull up all the stores, and then you go about translating like reviews, looking at pictures. One of the great things is Chinese people have like this pretty big review culture where they review things in great detail and post pictures of it, so you can quickly get a feeling for what local people think. But yeah,
This is
it's a much
Baidu.
longer process. Go ahead.
This is Baidu that you're searching on.
No. So I would I would search most stuff on the Maps apps. So there's two major ones. It's called Gouda Maps or A Maps, AMAPS, and then also Baidu Maps, which is like Google Maps. And yeah, you would search. I would search on there. For me, that was easier because it automatically pulls up pictures next to it, similar to Google Maps. Whereas if you Baidu is essentially useless if you're a foreigner because it's like links, like Google. So you just search and you pull up a page of all characters, all Chinese characters. So at the beginning of my trip, I was like, bruh, like, what am I doing? Where am I going? Because things are really hard to find. You need to be able to type some characters. But but then you start to find, phrases and like it's helpful because maybe you find one really good store and then the recommendations will be other kind of niche boutiques that are related to that store or maybe carry similar brands. But I would say like yeah, it's harder to find as a foreigner.
Nice. And like how many days would you be staying in each city on this trip?
Maybe 3 to 4. I would at first I was staying probably like 6 or 7, which I think is too long because there's this big language barrier. um you don't need that much time because you can't do everything. I can speak a little bit of Chinese, but still, like, if I want to go to a spa, there's going to be so many questions that they're asking you, so many apps that maybe you don't have. And it's just essentially a little bit harder to do certain things with a large language barrier. So 3 to 4 days, I could, do most of what I wanted to in the city, do some kind of 1 day nature excursion, and then move on.
Nice, nice. That's a great process. So talk about like once you get into the store, like what's your process of discovery? Like if you're going from like, just searching for like what you see in pictures, are you looking like for specifically like a interesting like way they've laid out the store? Are you looking for like concept stores in particular? Are you looking to like see stores that like particularly are interested in providing a specific experience for their customers? Like what catches your eye?
That's a that's a good question. I don't think I have a super strategic approach. Probably my main aim is find a brand I really like already. Make sure the store carries that brand. Like that's how I would essentially find the store. In China, if what my go-to brand was this brand Aviva Jifei Shui, which is actually a New York-based designer, but they're Chinese and primarily carried in China. And so they have a stockist list on their website, and they're kind of like Uma Wong, Ziggy Chen, but not dark, like much more like accessible clothing. You don't have to look like you're like goth or like, gonna hurt somebody. So yeah, I that was like kind of the brand that I would really try and seek out. And then, one of the perks of going with a local brand like this is then you can usually the store is going to carry other brands that are local, like other Chinese brands. Or in Japan, my go-to was like Fumito Ganryu, like I said, and because this is like a slightly more niche Japanese designer, then that those Japanese stores would usually carry other niche Japanese designers. Or in Korea, you could go with like post archive fashion, something that is, from that country. And so the stores are usually like more dialed in on like, local fashion, local designer fashion. So I think like when you're in a different country, like this would be kind of that was one of my strategies. And then outside of that, I'm just trying to see new clothing, see stuff I haven't seen before, which I think is like genuinely the best in China because, like we talked about, some things are just harder to find. Even when you're there, they're harder to find. And so you will discover more. Whereas in Japan, the shopping experience is amazing, but I really felt like I'd seen most things online before.
Yeah, just in terms of like it being more accessible and people willing to engage with international markets in Japan, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So once you, I guess, kind of like go into these stores and find these stores, like what's the sort of attitude towards like, you know, white guy coming in and filming everything? Is that kind of cool? Do they expect like people to like be posting on social media and sort of engaging in that way with their store?
In Yeah, in China, they have a really open mindset towards filming. Um, you know, TikTok comes from China, and their Chinese version is called Douyin, but it's the exact same,
It's
and same
ByteDance still,
logo.
yeah.
Say it again.
It's ByteDance. It's the same company, right?
Exactly, same company, and so they just have a different name, but yeah, the same logo for TikTok is Douyin, and um, people like a lot of people have their livelihood on here, like a lot of people, more so than on TikTok, and so you'll see regularly people like outside, doing some dances or like so people seem much more like this sort of public filming is much more normalized there. So I would say in general, people don't seem uncomfortable to be filmed. But I still feel uncomfortable to be filming. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
so usually I am more sneaky with the clips. And then you'll still run into some stores like in Wong. I don't know if you know this, if people watching know this brand, but really recommend checking out. Like one of
Uma
the
Wong,
first
they're
Chinese
distributed
brands to break
internationally.
out
Check them out at
onto
your
the
local DSM.
yeah, yeah, yeah. One of the first Chinese brands to break onto the international scene. I think she went to Paris in like 2009. So they're dope. And
Ethnically Chinese. I want to do put a pint on it. Like all of her amazing clothes, they're all manufactured in Italy, folks. This is not that Chinese. Zicky Chen, which you brought up, I would actually consider a straight out Chinese brand, right? Like a lot of their
yeah, yeah,
manufacturing
but I
is
think
actually in China.
still like Chinese people have this kind of belief that foreign stuff, like international stuff, is more special. But there's some really good factories in China. So I think like part of the idea with Wong was when she was like first coming out, it was like in order to sell products at a really high price, you need to produce in Italy. Like it's just a fact because um, otherwise people are like dubious to the quality. But
Would you say that's still a problem with domestic brands now? Because like I think like I've traveled a little bit across Europe, and an experience that I had in Poland, right, was that I was in Warsaw, the capital city of Poland, and I was trying to find like an actual like Polish fashion house to like try to like discover and learn about. And I went to like their big department store in downtown Warsaw. I think it's called Vistek or something like that. And I was trying to find literally any Polish brands, and of course they had all the international names from like Hermes to Vetements to I think a basement, a whole floor dedicated to Louis Vuitton, right? But
sure.
the issue was that they didn't really capture any sort of the domestic brands. I think the most they had was like two pieces from I think the brand's called Mischief, which is like just like a regular streetwear brand. I wouldn't consider
Misfit?
them like particularly
Oh, I know.
Mischief.
Yeah, yeah, I know. Yeah,
Mischief or Misfits or something like that. It begins with M. I don't think
yeah. No, I
it's
know what you're
Mischief
talking about.
because Mischief is like the
Depends
troll
on a
brand. They're
brand.
Americans, all right? But it was a Polish brand, and that was the only one that they had. There was this sort of like impulse against a domestic brand within a luxury context.
Is
They
there
still,
is
I
there
think,
any
have.
other domestic designer brands in Poland?
I imagine there must have been, but like again, like it's very difficult to like reach like even a select shop who's willing to like stock a majority like domestic production, right? Or any sort of thing that like engages with the heritage. Because like say when I was in London on that same trip, this was during like the beginning of like the uh Ukrainian war, we had all these Ukrainian designers that were kind of in refugee status showing in like a lot of London boutiques and having trunk sales, right? And there were just loads and loads of Ukrainian designers and brands being featured and platformed in London at that time. And
Yeah.
like obviously like Poland isn't like in the midst of like some sort of like rallying point of cultural necessity, right? Like there wasn't that need to promote like their cultural identity, but there wasn't any internal promotion within Poland, even within like fashion circles, within like going to these like large boutiques and asking around, hey, are there boutiques that specialize in domestic brands? They just weren't really able to give us anything past like a few skateboarding shops that like had like a streetwear line, right? But like later, I was able to like research and look up like say like a perfume house that's from Poland and stuff like that.
Mm,
Like, but there was no real interest in like sort of promoting those domestic brands when I was visiting, and I was wondering like, does that attitude still exist in like the select shops in China, where like you're not like going to like the shops that like carry the big brands like Louis and Gucci and what have you. I think in your Chengdu video you talked about like going to a luxury mall that was very recently opened and kind of being disappointed by like the fact that like only it was just the big international brands. When you go to like the smaller select shops, right? These buyer houses, maybe I think
yeah,
is the
yeah,
equivalent in their local language. What was their attitude there?
yeah. No, it's a great question. With like I said, they in China they view some things that are foreign as special. So imported clothing usually, is an easier justification for a higher price. I think this in some ways exists everywhere. Like, oh, this is from France, and so it's a little bit special. Um, but so in a lot of buyer stores, it would be brands from all over the place and not predominantly Chinese. I think this is a function of in China, there's still not that many like really high end designer brands. There's more brands that are at kind of a lower mid range um, that are that are cool, but not. I'm not hyped on seeing them. But I would just say in general, yeah, China now at this point has really the ability to produce high quality stuff, so it's wrong to have like a stigma of like made in China. I mean, it's just it's so hard to make these generalizations. Like, I think a brand that we both follow is Omar Afridi. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, they're a London-based brand, but if you've ever bought anything from them, I have like 4 or 5 pieces now, and all of them are made in China. But man, this the quality is some of the highest that I personally own or have. It's really tangible, and so you can still find the cheap stuff in China undoubtedly. But I think they also have some factories that are doing stuff at like an amazing level, and that is quite expensive, but still not as expensive as producing in a country like the US. And so this is kind of the trade-off. It's like, do you want your stuff produced in the US? Like, personally, no, because you're paying for a higher price of land that the factory is on. You're paying the higher wages of workers just because our living, cost of living is so much higher. And then there's likely less experience at the factory. And so I would argue, like, in some, you just have to, it's easier if you have the ability to feel the clothing, but it essentially doesn't matter where it's made.
Yeah, I think that's definitely um, something that a lot of people, especially in the fashion community, are actively trying to combat. Like this idea that just because it's from a designer that's located within side of a production company of like country, like say Bangladesh or India or Korea or what have you, that it isn't like some sort of like cut out the middleman closer to the factory, so we'll give you cheaper prices sort of deal, right? It's not a
Sure.
value proposition. It's like it actually is somebody who's closer, in fact, to the crafting of these garments, right?
Yeah. And obviously, I want to say, if there's ethical issues if factories aren't paying the workers livable wage, and that's how it's so cheap. I don't agree with that. But the truth is that you know cost of living makes a big difference. So wages can be, significantly lower because these can still be livable wages. This is why so many US companies produce in China. We still have tight regulations that make, the Chinese companies pay their workers a certain wage. We buy it from them, and then we can still fit in a pretty comfortable margin just because it's, significantly lower cost of living.
Yeah, yeah. Um, okay. So think that's all I have in terms of questions about China in particular. The main thing again is like this sort. I wanted to approach you and get you on the show because you have this like great curiosity for like discovering brands. How do you like look at a garment and go, okay, this is actually something of quality? What's your marker for like this is something that like isn't like a gimmick? Because I think that's like a thing
Yeah.
that like ties in with the idea of like you can't really trust the sourcing with a lot of the brands in terms of like, oh, it being made in China means like there must be some labor problem or there must be some like lower QA or something like that. Like, how do you determine quality in general?
Yeah, it always changes. I think for me now, like probably fabric is the biggest indicator of quality, because fabric is a major piece of the garment cost. I worked as a sourcing assistant at one point, so when you get quotes from a factory, the bulk of the price is usually going to come from the fabric, and then
Not labor.
I still
Interesting.
want some sort of distinctive twist, and so I definitely feel that like certain brands that are really design focused, but the quality is essentially on par with any mass market brand, whether it be fast fashion or not. Um, that is not a worthwhile. That is not a worth a good trade off in my mind. Like, I totally feel design is important, but looking at brands like Vetements or like Balenciaga, I think like this whole idea, of we're gonna sell something for, something basic for really expensive, and that's like the shock value. When you really see those pieces up close, like genuinely they are normal. And I think this is the case with like so much designer fashion, even like really like houses that I are luxury fashion, even with houses that I really like Marni. Their t-shirts go up in price every single year. It's so dumb. They are selling at like $450 now, maybe 500, and they're just graphic t-shirts. And so I think this is like a big reason why designer fashion and luxury fashion gets such a bad rep, because in essence many of the brands are just taking advantage of customers, with the price hikes and no change in quality. So because I've been able to travel and go to a lot of different stores, I've had the privilege to feel a lot of clothing, and that can give you, some distinction of, okay, I'm paying for something a little bit more special. Um, like I was talking about with Omar Freedy, in one of their collections, they all most of the outerwear was like this Loro Piana Clima System fabric. It's 100% wool, but it has these performance abilities, like it's waterproof and you can use it as a rain jacket, stuff like that. And so Loro Piana essentially licenses out this fabric. I think like Gabriella Cole Garments has also used it, and a couple other designers. So you're getting the unique design of a small independent brand that wants to have this kind of put out their own style in a sense, but you're also getting the quality and heritage of like a really high end house like Loro Piana that, produces luxury fabric. Like that's the idea. So when I see like little collaborations like this, or ways that, um, you know, you have to be really skeptical as a consumer, because yeah, a lot of things are just going to be trying to sell you, but to me, this can be a good indicator of quality.
Yeah, I think there is that like degree of like pointing to this is a specific factory or this is a specific technology that is being incorporated here that leads to a I don't know, like to use a dumb business term, a competitive advantage of it as like a point of material versus like a point of design, which is obviously subjective, versus like a point of like where the brand's position, which is like money spent on marketing versus like on the individual garment, right? And like it's this question of quality that's like thing that like stops people from being uh go in and take a chance on like a smaller brand, independent brand, or a brand. Like
Yeah.
because I think one of the things that's really exciting for your content is because you do talk about the travel smaller brands. There's this possibility of like not having heard of it before, seeing the actual physical garment in the shop, touching it, feeling it, and going, "Wow." it's in my hand. I can interact with it as like a physical garment outside of the marketing, outside of my context of knowing anything about it. I'm gonna invest my money in. That's like, I think like something that's particularly magical about like the sort of like travel and discovery that you do. Do you ever feel magic of that, or is it not like is it more straightforward for you?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, no, it's important for me to show the brands that are smaller, kind of the discoveries I'm making, because that was a big point of, the trip or the stores I want to go to is, personal discovery and then share it, right? I want the best for these brands because they're producing clothing that's different and interests me. So I don't want them to go away. So yeah, the kind of exposure that I would want to see on YouTube, um, is essentially what I want to show from these small brands. Um, but yeah, at the same time, you can't buy everything. So I totally understand like going, a resistance or hesitance to buy into a small brand because essentially they have a less of a track record. Um, but yeah, maybe with little, small subtitles, I'll call out when something really, impresses me about the quality or just some detail, which would be really hard to notice online. So that's where I think, yeah, making videos can add a lot to, um, showing people the clothing, because a picture just doesn't really, it's not going to show you the movement and the drape of the clothing or the details from multiple angles. So e-commerce has come so far, and there's, mass retailers like Essence, but at the same time I think like some sort of video element is really helpful to showing the clothing.
Yeah. Video element or like just like the sort of testimonial of like I touched it. How much do you
Mm.
think like traveling has made you a more discerning buyer?
In what way?
Well, in the sense that, like, do you feel the impulse to like, I think, uh, go out of your way if there were, say, two options, like even like on the level of like Fumetto Ganryu, which is like a brand that's like definitely more regional to Japan, but is like a CDG brand from what I understand. Like they are somehow financially and
Not
like
anymore,
terms of
but
any.
yeah, initially he was under their umbrella, like they gave him a brand, but then he that was called just Ganryu, and then he spun off and now it's independent.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, didn't know that actually. I just know that like I think Overstreet Market doesn't really carry their stuff that much. Um, so that's like a bigger name though, right? Like if you take like a bigger name like that, versus like a smaller brand that's like producing like say for instance like a hoodie, right? If both of these brands are providing hoodie, do you feel an impulse to support the smaller brand? Do you
No.
feel like an impulse to like not at all? Okay, it's all about who's got the superior product.
For me, yes. The truth is the smaller brands are selling at a really high price as well. So yeah, the better product is the most important.
Okay, yeah. You ever would you consider like your particular like sense of like personal style and how you curate your closet and like what you wear be that trendy or like anti-trendy? Like what's your like relationship towards like how much like a product might be in the cultural consciousness versus like something that's like just born out of the experience of like interacting with the product?
Yeah, I'm not super worried about being on trend, but I'm super influenced by trends because I follow so many brands and, essentially shop frequently. Um, I'm basically seeing trends very regularly. So you can just think of it as I'm seeing advertising. So it has an impact on me, absolutely. But it's not like I feel like I'm missing out on certain trends. Probably the most interesting thing to me is when a designer does a trend in a way that completely shifts my perspective on it. Like I really hate cargo pants. I think they're like not at all elevated, and the silhouette is not flattering. So this is like a trend that I'm not that I wasn't, like this is great. but it has been ongoing for so long, it feels like. But then some designers, because you just have this huge proliferation of, many designers want their take on it. They want a commercial product that retailers are going to gravitate towards. So yeah, I've seen some really cool versions, like Omar Afridi. Dries did some cool cargos. MM6 has done some cool ones. And so I think, the idea of trends can make it so you just see it, you can change your mind on almost any style. But so obviously, in that sense, like I think I'm buying more baggy clothing because you see so much of it now. But I'm not like focused on being on trend. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I
that
just buy
definitely
too
makes
much clothes.
sense. Yeah, I mean, like that's like I think that line of questioning really comes from the idea of like interacting and going out there and seeing like the garments in person, because I feel like all the way back to the beginning of the discussion, you got involved in fashion because of like an online community and way of discussing about like these clothes that had like these unique elements to them, these unique specialities, and bits of being off or being unique or quirky or special, that like reads like interestingly on a spec sheet, but like might have a different effect in person. And like I guess like sort of area of interest is like what in what ways has your ability to go to like Milan, Tokyo, China, and like touch these pieces in person versus like just kind of hear discussion or see them on sale on Essence. How much in what ways has that changed your methods of buying, collecting, and relating to the clothes?
Yeah, I would say outside of shopping, just the simple idea of traveling with with a bag makes it so my purchasing habits are more oriented around um, stuff that is cohesive, because before I was just buying what I thought was the coolest version of something. But when you're really limited in the clothes that you can bring or wear, then I'm much more about, things that are versatile within my wardrobe. And that gets harder and harder as, your wardrobe is essentially fixing in on one style. So then, your lens of, okay, what is going to match with all the things I already own? eh, there's a pretty small amount of things that satisfy that. So I think just traveling in that sense has made me a little more intentional with, okay, how is this going to go with, every other pair of pants I own. But then feeling the clothing, I would say shopping wise, I don't think it has changed me too much. More so, it's just I think I've been surprised by pieces that maybe are like under some, they're like layered on the runway, so you can't really see it that well, and then be- that becomes my favorite piece in of the season. For example, there was this like Magliano button-up fleece. It was like a Native American type shirt, like a Pendleton pattern shirt, but it was like spliced up into three different patterns that were tonal. It was fucking cool. And this was like under a jacket, so you could only see like a sleeve of it. Like you couldn't even see the layered or the different patterns on the runway. So it never would have been on my radar. But then in the store, you feel the fabric and the fit is really cool. And so I think in that sense, it's just like really important to see clothing. Like from henceforth, I really try and not buy anything without at least trying it on first, because I think like it's just impossible to get like a perfect idea of a piece of clothing without trying it on. But of course, that's easier said than done because, you know, if you live in the middle of the US or in Europe, whatever, odds are you can't try on most of the brands you like. So, but I guess that can also like lead some of your vacations. If you go on one vacation a year, maybe you can try and go to a city like Chicago or something where it's like, oh, I have the ability to go to a boutique or something like this. Depends on what your priorities are, I guess.
Hell yeah. No, I appreciate the Chicago shout out too, because I think there was a store called Haven in Chicago. It's a really cool boutique. And they were actually the first place I ever saw Magliano. There's a Magliano shirt off screen over there, and I'm gonna not reach for. But they're a
Oh,
wonderful
for real?
brand.
That's dope.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it was the first place that I saw Magliano because they had like this like super unique and like super stretched and like vintage looking distorted knitwear, and they had some of that in the store, and it was my first time seeing that stuff. So yes, if folks in the audience are going to be influenced by Mr. Influencer on here, it's to get out there and spend your money on looking and touching these clothes. You'll buy less, and you'll enjoy your clothes more.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and at the same time, you may buy more because you may discover stuff that wasn't on your wish list, um, which is cool too. But yeah, I think like as far as discovery,
Mhm.
um, it's really hard to perfectly understand a piece when you see it online because the truth is the models are I almost don't understand this because the models are a really small percentage of the body types out there. Like I don't feel the need to be better represented at all. But I'm just saying that the way a piece of clothing fits on a model is so different, right? Because they're so fucking tall and really skinny. Um, so yeah, it just being able to try so many things on. I think subconsciously I'm much better at now gravitating towards things that suit me a little bit more.
Nice, nice. Okay. Well, I guess wrapping up, was one thing that like you feel like is a part of the current like I guess milieu of fashion discourse that you think is a really good thing, and what's one thing that just really grinds your gears and you don't even understand why it's like a thing people talk about?
One good thing in the current fashion zeitgeist.
Yeah, yeah, that people are discussing. Like, for instance, one of the things that I think is actually a particular positive conversation is that a lot of people right now are talking about how, like, a lot of YouTube influencers and people who talk about, like, personal style and the growth and journey of exploring personal style are kind of almost promoting overconsumption because it's about, like, them trying to say, oh, it doesn't matter if you don't like this or this. You should just buy it regardless. Try it out. If you don't like it, go out and buy the next thing and what have you.
Mm,
And they're trying to de-influence people from, like, you know, thinking about personal style as like this sort of like marathon you have to get through with like an end goal versus something you should try to take as slow as possible and like explore like at your own pace instead of like trying to like I think railroad yourself towards like the final form of your personal style or whatever, right? Like that's a thing that like a lot of influencers have been talking about as like a negative thing now of like the sort of like speed run towards finding a personal style.
okay.
So like that's like for something that's in a discourse because I know like like as you said you're very online. So what's online that's annoying you? What's online that's like okay, no, people should be talking about this.
Got you. Got you. Um, Let me think for just a sec. Okay, I think one thing that that is a little bit annoying, maybe from my perspective, is how many brands use synthetic materials. Not from maybe a waste perspective, because I think in general, the designer brands will never come close to like a juggernaut like Zara or Temu or whatever. So not from a waste perspective, but I really think that Japanese brands a lot are kind of slacking on quality for moving more towards design focused. Um, so I don't know. I just
It's a
when I
controversial take. So many
yeah,
people in the
to
comments are
be
gonna
that
be
for that to
like,
be a
being
hot
like, but
take, but I think it's
Yoji uses
positive.
polyester. Yoji's polyester is good.
You'll see, honestly, you'll see it a lot if you follow mostly Japanese brands. You see so much polyester these days. It's becoming more and more frequent, and oh, it's light and waterproof, yada yada. But really, I feel that this kind of idea of a garment aging and getting better, a lot of Japanese brands have moved away from that, and it's so much more design focused. That that was truly not meant to be a hot take, but I think yeah,
We'll see
that
how
was.
people
I
react to
just
that.
think in general the prices of some brand of like a lot of pieces don't like warrant it. Like there's like some pieces that fully do, and I'm like on board with like designer prices. I understand that like you're selling at a lower quantity, but I think like if you want to be taken more seriously as a brand, then like the quality of the fabric should definitely be like more of a priority, kind of as we talked about a bit. So maybe that would be one thing I don't like. Um, in general, there's nothing like that loving about like the current fashion zeitgeist. I guess like I just think some brands are really like killing it right now. Like we mentioned Magliano, Omar Afridi, uh, Kiko. I think is has been good. I'm not a huge fan of the current Kiko season. I'm quite like an opinionated person, and brands like change quite frequently. But yeah, I mean, some of these small brands are great, and I think the fact that they're able to accrue such a large social media following is pretty positive. Um, I don't know if I exactly hit your question on the head. Oh,
Well, well, go ahead, go ahead.
I have one other take. I think for the past couple of years, I would love to hear your opinion on this, but I've seen so much talk about um, the oh, it's great baggy jeans and a more relaxed style, a more oversized style, and the people throwing the skinny jeans out the window. But I would honestly say that we're moving away from this, and and some brands are starting to move away, but I'm ready for that kind of swing of the pendulum back to more slim fitting styles because if you go to like many stores, like you currently see what is out there, what's like, brands are selling, bruh, it's so boxy, so oversized. And I think like when I was traveling, many of the jackets that are like really boxy are not very warm. So if like this is your whole closet, then like I don't want to be stuck in that kind of oversized style. And it truthfully is like so much less flattering. So that's
No,
one
I
other.
totally agree that like folks in the fashion community, have started to like want to move on from like these ultra boxy cuts, right? I don't necessarily think that wide is going to go away because like I don't think there's actually that much like mass market adoption yet of like wider silhouettes. Like obviously all the like the mainstream influencers, GQ, they're all pushing like these high waisted, wider like styles, pleating, all that. Now everybody from Converse to their uncles making a penny loafer, right? Because we are trying to turn back into like the 1950s sort of influence style that people were getting in like the 90s, right? But I think the super skinny silhouette, however, like I think there's still like an association of like how like that hasn't quite yet totally dematerialized from mainstream fashion, and like especially people who don't really follow fashion still wearing skinny, super tight, almost legging style denim and like super tight matchstick style pants. I do, however, encourage I think a silhouette in which you take like a skinnier silhouette, but like add like a degree of movement and drama to them. I'm thinking of like the popularization of like the flare denim right now because Kendrick Lamar appeared with flare denim during his performance during the Super Bowl, caused a big stir on social media, and be like, "What, flares are back? Boot cuts are back?" That sort of thing. And the marketplace, and I don't think there was resistance from the mainstream on that end, but there was definitely like it was still a shock of the new, and I think that style is going to be in rotation for a lot longer, where you maybe have like a skinnier leg, but you'll still have like the flare. And also a thing that I think might be plausible is that like as people are so interested in genderless styles nowadays that we're sort of embraced to like selling to both men and women just from an economic standpoint with these boxier silhouettes, like these more formless, oversized things just from like an economic perspective, you can sell to both sexes, right? They're more unisex. I think you can move towards a thing where you have like skinnier like legs or leggings in terms of bottoms, but then like add in layers of elements of layering, like if not a full out skirt, for instance, or like we'll have a move back to like the beginning of the 2010s style or late 2000 style of like going in layers of having not just like a longer drop crotch like cut to like a pair of trousers, but also having longer tunics that you can wear as like a top, and like just in general layering as like an element of distinction that can work with the skinnier cuts of like bottoms without going straight back to like the whole Dior Homme, Hedi Slimane, heroin cheek shit, which I think like, everybody and like, their genitals is happy isn't going to make a total comeback.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Like, if you look at like current Kiko pants and stuff, there are these like more skinny styles that have these darts where maybe there's some like flaring, or it's like a legging where it, flares out at the bottom. So I think that already is happening for sure. Um, and but I just feel that like if you want to be disruptive as a brand right now, like it would be almost a a simple way to move into a little bit more slim styles, because it's so saturated right now as far as like the baggy, boxy jackets, really wide pants. I just see it everywhere. And if you think about like a brand like Our Legacy, where their third cut has essentially not changed for like 10 years, like this is like their best selling jeans. I think that like in my opinion, obviously, like you said, mainstream is not at the same rate of adoption, but in my opinion, it's a little bit overdone. And I think, like you also mentioned, these are essentially formless styles. Like if you're selling a full unisex line, then you don't have a very distinctive fit model. So I feel that if you really like find clothes that fit you, they should often be a little bit tighter. Obviously, there's exceptions to this with every rule. Like I still think like Head Maynor should keep doing like his thing, and the really oversized stuff has like an interest to me. And there's some brands that do it really well, but for the most part, I think that like some brands are just getting away with um, there's only one part of say you're taking a really wide pair of pants and you're just making the waist size different. This doesn't lead to a super interesting silhouette to me. Like I don't care that it moves a lot if it's just really really baggy. So that was like almost just not at all your question.
No, I do appreciate the hot takes though. That's like this is the sort of thing that's exciting to talk about now. Is that like you're talking about moving silhouettes and like changing tastes and like how much like I guess my point of interest in like that sort of discourse is how much do you think fashion and being a fan of fashion and being in the fashion hobby and being in the fashion community is about in and out groups? How much of it is like realizing, oh, we've been sitting in this for a while. The normies are starting to take
Mm.
notice. We got to move on. Like, do you feel that at all?
Yeah, for sure. Like we just talked about with I mean, I think also because I was traveling, you see so many people, in China, bruh, it's so crowded, it's just ridiculous. So you see so many people, and then certain styles are gonna get essentially old in your eyes. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, as corny as it is, a lot of fashion is about something new and something fresh, that is more interesting to see, and maybe, yeah, you haven't seen before. And so I think like maybe I got a little bit more sick of it quicker because I was just seeing, tons and tons of people in baggy clothes, and it would just no longer had the same newness to it. I think this is, some people may feel, okay, these are about micro trends and it's moving too fast and overconsumption. But at the same time, this makes it fun because you are, regularly seeing brands reinvent themselves. That, in my mind, is not always a bad thing. Like sometimes it just depends, but you get to see so many different takes on a style, and yeah, it keeps it interesting.
That's great. Lastly, I think, do you believe
Mhm.
fashion is a force for good in the world? And if so, how?
Of course, yeah, I do. Uh, in Japan, people put, this, you can tell people put some emphasis into how they're stepping out of the house. There's little, details which people put some care into, and it just elevates everything. It makes it so um, when you're walking around, you're gonna notice more beautiful details, and things become like and things become nicer to look at. It's like it can change your day, like make your day better if you see a really unique outfit, which something is like there's a little twist to it or something. It can just change how your mood is. That's my opinion. But not everyone sees it this way. Of course, in the U.S., there's a kind of a mindset that a lot of people think consumption and clothing is superficial. It's not. It's what is inside that matters. But I don't agree with this. I think that this kind of form of expression is essentially an art that can change how we perceive our society. So I think it can be really positive if people you know put in a little extra care. um, but I totally understand people that differ with that opinion.
All right, thanks so much for your time. I think we've had a great conversation.
Yeah, man, thanks for having me on.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see Duncan later. I'll post again his YouTube in the chat, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks so much for your time.
Cool, bro. Thanks, Mike.
All right, have a good one.